Picture this. You're the most powerful woman in Europe, married to a king who controls half the known world, and your only job, your single crucial purpose, is to produce a male heir. After years of failed pregnancies, miscarriages, and phantom pregnancies that left you humiliated before entire courts, you finally feel the unmistakable signs of life growing within you. This time, it will be different. This time, you will birth the prince that secures your throne and your very survival. Instead, you deliver a corpse, and then, as if God himself has decided to punish you for your failures, your own body begins to decay while you're still alive, rotting from the inside out in ways that medieval medicine can't explain and can't stop. Welcome to the nightmare of Mary Tudor, Queen of England, whose tragic descent into madness and physical deterioration became one of the most horrifying royal medical mysteries in European history. Today, I'm going to take you through the brutal reality of what happened when the most feared queen in English history discovered that sometimes the crown's greatest enemy isn't rebellion or invasion. It's your own flesh turning against you. And if you're ready to dive into one of history's most disturbing royal tragedies, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because we have countless more stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, medicine, and the human body. Let's begin with the pregnancy that started Mary's descent into a living hell. Mary Tudor had been queen for less than 2 years when she announced to her court something that would either secure her reign or destroy her completely. She was with child. At 38 years old, this wasn't just a pregnancy. It was a miracle, a divine intervention that would finally give England the Catholic male heir she desperately needed to undo her father Henry VIII's Protestant Revolution. The signs were unmistakable. Her belly swelled, her breasts enlarged. She experienced morning sickness that left her retching for hours. Court physicians confirmed what everyone could see. Queen Mary was carrying the future of Catholic England in her womb. Preparations began immediately for what would be the most important birth in English history. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Medieval pregnancy diagnosis was primitive at best, relying entirely on external symptoms that could be mimicked by dozens of other conditions. What Mary's physicians couldn't know was that the Queen's body was already betraying her in ways that would soon become grotesquely apparent. For 9 months, Mary's belly continued to grow. She felt movement, or convinced herself she did. The entire court prepared for the arrival of the prince who would restore Catholic rule to England. Nobles gathered, celebrations were planned, and official announcements were sent to royal courts across Europe. The birth of Mary's heir would be witnessed by dozens of courtiers, ensuring no questions about legitimacy. The labor began in April 1555, and that's when the nightmare truly started. Mary labored for days, not hours, days. Her screams echoed through Hampton Court Palace as waves of agony tore through her body. But something was wrong, terribly, unnaturally wrong. The baby that finally emerged after this prolonged torture wasn't the prince England was expecting. It was a corpse, not a stillborn child, something far worse. What came from Mary's womb was a mass of decayed tissue that had been dead for months, rotting inside her while she celebrated her pregnancy and planned her heir's future. The smell was so overwhelming that even the experienced midwives fled the birthing chamber. But the horror was just beginning. Within hours of this grotesque birth, Mary's own body began showing signs of the same decay that had consumed her phantom child. What happened next defied every understanding of medicine and human biology that existed in the 16th century. Mary's abdomen, already traumatized by the horrific labor, began to emit the same putrid odor that had emanated from the dead tissue she'd delivered. But this wasn't external infection. This was something far more sinister. Her flesh was rotting from the inside out. It started around her reproductive organs. The tissue became discolored, turning shades of green and black that physicians had never seen in a living patient. The smell was so overwhelming that servants refused to enter her chambers without cloths soaked in perfume covering their faces. Mary Tudor, the most powerful woman in England, was literally decomposing while still alive. Court physicians were baffled. They'd seen infections. They'd treated battlefield wounds. They'd dealt with every manner of medieval medical emergency. But they'd never encountered a living patient whose flesh was actively decaying while she remained conscious and aware. Their treatments, bloodletting, herbal poultices, prayers, not only failed to help, but seemed to accelerate the process. The rot spread systematically, from her abdomen to her thighs, from her torso to her arms. The discoloration followed patterns that made no medical sense, as if her body was following some internal map of decay that obeyed rules unknown to human understanding. Mary could watch her own flesh changing color, could smell her own decomposition, could feel the strange sensations as healthy tissue transformed into something that belonged in a grave. And the most horrifying part? She remained fully conscious throughout the entire process. This wasn't a merciful slide into unconsciousness. This was a front-row seat to her own gradual transformation into a living corpse. As Mary's condition worsened, her behavior became increasingly erratic in ways that terrified even her closest advisors. She began spending hours each day in prayer, not the gentle devotions of a pious queen, but desperate, screaming pleas to God that could be heard throughout the palace. She was begging for either healing or death, anything to end the nightmare her life had become. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Mary refused to acknowledge what was happening to her body. Despite the obvious evidence of decay, despite the smell that made courtiers physically ill, despite the visible discoloration spreading across her flesh, she insisted she was still pregnant. She claimed the birth had been premature and that the real prince was still growing inside her. This wasn't just denial. This was a complete break from reality driven by the unbearable horror of her situation. Mary would spend hours talking to her swollen, rotting abdomen as if it contained a living child. She would place her hands on the decaying tissue and describe feeling movement, kicks, the active signs of healthy pregnancy. Her courtiers were trapped in an impossible situation. How do you tell the Queen of England that she's literally rotting away while she insists she's carrying the heir to the throne? How do you maintain royal protocol when the smell of decay makes it impossible to breathe in the same room as your sovereign? If you're finding this descent into royal madness as fascinatingly horrific as I did when I first discovered this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We have so many more tales of historical nightmare that will leave you questioning the very nature of human experience. The solution the court developed was perhaps the most macabre example of royal denial in European history. Rather than confront the reality of Mary's condition, the entire English court entered into a conspiracy of silence that transformed the royal palace into a theatre of the absurd. Courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths, to position themselves upwind of the Queen, to maintain expressions of normalcy while surrounded by the unmistakable evidence of human decay. Official court records from this period reveal the extraordinary lengths to which everyone went to maintain the fiction that their queen was healthy and pregnant. Letters to foreign courts continued to reference Mary's delicate condition and approaching confinement. Preparations for the royal birth continued, even as the Queen's flesh visibly rotted before their eyes. The most disturbing aspect of this conspiracy was how it affected Mary's medical care. Physicians who might have been able to help, or at least ease her suffering, were forced to treat a pregnant queen rather than a woman whose body was consuming itself. They couldn't address the decay because officially there was no decay. They couldn't treat the infection because officially Mary was experiencing the normal discomforts of late pregnancy. This medical gaslighting created a feedback loop of horror. Mary's untreated condition worsened, making her behavior more erratic, which made the court more desperate to maintain their fiction, which prevented proper medical intervention, which made everything worse. Meanwhile, the smell had become so overwhelming that the entire palace began to reek of decay. Servants developed elaborate systems for changing linens and cleaning chambers that had to account for the fact that the source of the contamination was the Queen herself. Foreign ambassadors reported that visiting the English court had become a physical ordeal that left them nauseated for days afterward. What exactly was killing Mary Tudor? Modern medical analysis of historical accounts suggests she was suffering from what we now know as necrotizing fasciitis, a flesh-eating bacterial infection that literally consumes living tissue. But how did she contract such a condition, and why did it manifest in such a specific, horrifying way? The answer lies in the combination of her phantom pregnancy and the primitive medical practices of the 16th century. Mary was almost certainly suffering from what modern medicine calls pseudocyesis, false pregnancy, caused by hormonal imbalances and psychological factors. Her body was producing pregnancy symptoms without an actual fetus. creating the perfect conditions for internal bacterial growth. The birth that produced rotting tissue was likely the expulsion of accumulated infected material that had been growing in her uterus for months. When this infected mass was finally expelled, it introduced bacteria throughout her reproductive system, creating the ideal environment for necrotizing fasciitis to take hold. But here's what makes Mary's case uniquely horrifying. The combination of her specific bacterial infection with her pre-existing psychological condition created a perfect storm of physical decay and mental deterioration. As the infection spread, toxins released by the dying tissue affected her brain function, worsening her delusions and making rational medical treatment impossible. The courtiers who documented her condition described symptoms that perfectly match severe necrotizing fasciitis, rapid tissue death, overwhelming odor, systemic toxicity, and the characteristic discoloration that spread in unpredictable patterns across her body. What they were witnessing was one of the most aggressive bacterial infections known to medicine, consuming a living human being in real time. Mary's last months were a horror that defied human comprehension. The infection had spread throughout her torso, creating pockets of dead tissue that had to be drained regularly by physicians who worked with cloths covering their faces. The procedures were agony for Mary and revolting for everyone involved, but they were necessary to prevent the accumulation of toxins that would have killed her even faster. She began experiencing what medieval physicians called visions, hallucinations caused by the bacterial toxins affecting her brain. Mary claimed to see angels telling her that her suffering was divine punishment for allowing Protestant heretics to live. These visions drove her to order increasingly brutal persecutions of Protestants, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary, as she burned hundreds of people alive while her own body consumed itself. The irony was lost on no one. A queen whose flesh was rotting away was burning others for their religious beliefs, as if external flames could somehow purify the corruption consuming her from within. Each execution she ordered seemed to coincide with worsening of her physical condition, as if the act of burning others was somehow feeding the fire that was destroying her own body. In her final weeks, Mary's condition deteriorated so rapidly that courtiers began placing bets on how long she could survive. The infection had spread to her extremities, turning her fingers and toes black with necrosis. She could no longer walk without assistance, could barely eat without vomiting, and required constant medical attention just to manage the drainage from her dying tissue. The end, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. After months of spectacular suffering, Mary simply stopped breathing one morning in November 1558. Her body, which had fought so desperately against the infection consuming it, finally succumbed to the toxins that had been building in her system for nearly a year. But here's where the story takes its final disturbing turn. Mary's death was officially attributed to a tumor in the stomach, a convenient diagnosis that avoided any mention of the horrific reality that had consumed her final year. The courtiers who had witnessed her decomposition, the physicians who had attempted to treat her rotting flesh, the servants who had cleaned the infected drainage from her body, all were sworn to secrecy about what they had actually seen. The official autopsy, conducted by royal physicians who had been treating Mary throughout her illness, made no mention of the extensive tissue necrosis that had defined her final months. Instead, they reported finding evidence of a cancerous growth that explained her death in terms that wouldn't horrify the general population or damage the reputation of the Tudor dynasty. This cover-up was so successful that for centuries, historians accepted the official cause of death without question. It wasn't until modern medical experts analyzed the detailed personal accounts of courtiers and foreign ambassadors that the true nature of Mary's condition became apparent. She hadn't died of cancer. She had been consumed alive by one of the most aggressive bacterial infections in medical history. Mary Tudor's death marked the end of Catholic rule in England and paved the way for her half-sister Elizabeth's Protestant reign. But more than that, it represented something unprecedented in royal history. A monarch whose own body had become her greatest enemy, whose flesh had literally turned against her in ways that defied medical understanding. The psychological impact on those who witnessed Mary's decay lasted for generations. Foreign ambassadors reported nightmares about the smell of the English court. Courtiers who served during her final year struggled with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, Some became obsessed with cleanliness and hygiene, while others developed phobias about disease and infection that controlled their lives. Perhaps most disturbingly, Mary's case established a precedent for how royal medical conditions would be handled in the future. The conspiracy of silence that surrounded her decay became the template for managing other embarrassing royal health issues, creating a tradition of medical cover-ups that would persist for centuries. So there you have it, the horrific reality behind one of history's most tragic queens. Mary Tudor didn't just die, she decomposed while alive, suffered through months of unimaginable agony, and descended into madness while her entire court pretended nothing was happening. Her phantom pregnancy became a real nightmare that consumed her body from the inside out, turning the most powerful woman in England into a walking corpse. The brutal truth is that Mary's story illustrates how even absolute power becomes meaningless when your own flesh turns against you. All the royal physicians, all the court ceremony, all the divine right of kings couldn't save her from a bacterial infection that transformed her body into her own worst enemy. Now, if you've made it this far with me through one of history's most disturbing royal medical nightmares, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let us know what corner of the globe you're calling home, because it's fascinating to see how these dark historical tales reach people everywhere. And if you're hungry for more stories that will make you grateful for modern medicine and question everything you thought you knew about royal power, you know what to do. Subscribe to our channel. Trust me, we have historical nightmares that will haunt your dreams and change how you see the past forever. Until next time, remember, sometimes the crown's greatest enemy isn't rebellion or war, it's the very flesh that wears it.